Welcome to this episode of Against the Mountains of Madness. I'm your host, Jason.
And I'm John Wright.
And today we're going to be talking about, is reality real? You'd think it is, but you could be mistaken. So, John, is reality real? What does that even mean? I mean, of course it is. Is it?
Of course it is. And yet, when I say reality is real, I'm in the minority in the modern day. There are several ways in which the modern people seem to think that reality is not real. First is in the area of physics. We are all convinced that the material objects around us are made of particles, and the particles don't reflect the reality we see. That the red color in a red ball is not actually in the ball, but merely a hallucination produced by our eyes interacting with a complex dance of photons. So the modern materialist, who doesn't believe that the mental world exists, he thinks that the mental phenomenon are merely chemical, molecular, neural interactions in the brain, has a mystical view of reality because he believes the real reality is something we never reach. The noumenal reality is a dance of subatomic particles that produce probabilistic appearances of solidity and of continuity, but that the solidity of objects and the continuity of cause and effect is, according to them, make-believe. They certainly don't believe that the moral reality is real, even though those are things that you can't not know. There's a certain group of things that you cannot pretend. You can pretend you don't know them, but you know them. Okay, You can tell from the way people behave.
Agreed.
And the skepticism, which proved so useful in the study of the physical reality in engineering and in science, has gone insane and becomes applied to things like whether or not a person believes he himself exists. And there's four basic reasons for this, but basically the modern age has skeptically undermined every form of reality in which we believe. They don't believe the material world is real, they don't believe the mental world is real, they don't believe the moral world is real, and they don't believe the spiritual world is real. So they don't believe in that any reality is real. And they certainly don't believe that words can reflect reality, you see. So the disbelief in the reality of reality is a core belief of nearly every branch of modern philosophy and of the modern worldview. And it's so prevalent, by the way, that it's just a commonplace when you hear people talk about believing in yourself, as is usually the cure for every Saturday morning cartoon. They don't have Saturday morning cartoons anymore, but every Saturday morning cartoon has every Aesop's fable or every movie after school special will have a movie where the moral point of the episode is that you should have belief in yourself. It is also commonplace for people to say that you should believe in something, but it doesn't matter in what you believe. That your faith will cure you, but it doesn't have to be faith in God. It can be faith in anything you like, you see. And so we've because we don't believe reality is real, the modern has put himself into a situation where things that are so obvious that they can't be doubted. I mean, I know a person who doubts her own self-existence. She doesn't think the word I has a meaning. She thinks that she's a collection of properties that merely have been blown together like grains in a sand heap. The properties that comprise her herself exist, but the herself who owns those properties doesn't exist. So properties owned by something exist, but the something that owns the properties does not. Now, how can you tie yourself into such a knot as to not believe that you exist, that you believe in a world where red is not it's not a color, that your senses don't reflect reality, but that the only thing that exists is matter? Do you see the problem?
No, it's madness, but I assume there's some underlying reason why she wants to think this. She's not...
Oh, well, she's an atheist. She wants to avoid believing in abstract reality. She doesn't want to think forms are real. She doesn't want to think moral reality is real. She doesn't want to think spiritual reality is real. And in order to do that, she has to believe mental reality is not real. She has to believe that words innately can have no meaning, that they're completely arbitrary, and they don't point to or reflect any reality that's real. You see?
That must make conversation with her difficult.
What's that?
That must make conversation with her difficult.
If she were self-consistent with her own beliefs, it would.
Well, of course.
But she only uses that as a defensive mechanism, and I suspect all persons who claim to believe this philosophy, which we can call nominalism or non-essentialism, everyone who thinks that things don't have essences, everything that thinks that things don't have thingness,
Yeah.
things aren't things, A is not A, they don't believe it. They just use it as a defense mechanism. They use it as a sword and a shield to silence criticism and to avoid questions. That's all. They don't really believe it. They just use it as a way to pull the fire alarm when there's a conversation going away toward a conclusion that they find uncomfortable.
Well,
It's a tool of comfort. So people believe reality is not real because solipsism is a lot more comfortable, especially if you'd like to be God and you think the restrictions of reality stand in your way.
as they do. Often.
Now, I should point out that one pernicious side effect of believing in the unreality of reality is once you begin believing that anyone's belief is the same as anyone else's belief, that all beliefs are equal, and that anyone can believe anything he wishes, a man can believe he's a woman, that it becomes then a matter of violence for you to disagree with or question his reality. Because now you're not questioning his ideas about reality, you're questioning the only reality he has. You're actually destroying the only world he knows, as if the solid earth was being shattered to pieces by lightning bolts coming from your mouth. So they react violently. They react as if you are using physical violence on them.
I don't think that's why
And
they do that.
if they demand you accede to them, they could then claim that silence is violence so as to compel you to speak. You've got to use their pronouns. You've got to use their terminology. You've got to use the words they insist you use. And you have to say the slogans they insist you say. Otherwise, they will hurt you.
Well, I think actually
That's what comes of not believing the reality of reality.
I think the reason they do that is they say words of violence principally to justify doing violence to you for your words.
Of course.
Like I'm not sure it's that deep a principle. I think it's just an excuse
Of course.
to be
Of
able
course
to
it's just an
employ
excuse.
violence. So I always get it demanding they demand you use their pronouns, but they never seem to want to accept that they have to use my preferred adjectives of awesome and amazing.
Yeah.
Those are my preferred adjectives. You need to use them.
I also have preferred prepositions and preferred infinitives, and I mean,
Why not?
I prefer it if you don't split an infinitive. I think that to gratuitously split an infinitive is terrible.
Actually,
But-
we joke, but because I know Matt Walsh originally did the preferred adjectives joke, but then there was a TikTok video floating around of someone taking it seriously, like saying they have preferred adjectives, and it's just like, oh my god.
Once you grant the idea that all men are solipsists, that all reality is internal to us, once you grant that I am the only thing that's real, and that everything else is just an opinion of mine, a preference of mine, then the common ground of a shared language becomes impossible. And that is why shared language is the first target of political correctness. Political correctness is lying.
Yeah, of course.
It's just using euphemisms rather than using honest language, because honesty is based on the assumption that reality is real. If we all lived in a dream, if we all lived in the Matrix, in the illusion of Maya, if we were all deceived by the deceiver by the evil demiurge of Descartes, so that everything around us was a dream, everything around us was an illusion, we'd still exist because we're the deceived party, right?
Yeah.
If we then learn how to believe in ourselves and wake up, we become the enlightened ones. We become woke. We become gods. We become the only God there is because we're the only rational beings in the universe. Now, as the only God there is, we then get to decide good and evil, true and false, right and wrong, real and unreal. So we can really decree certain things to be unreal, such as, let's say, sex. We can point at the human race and say that is a unisexual creature as of now. We are no longer creatures with two
Sexually
sexes.
dimorphic is the word you're looking for.
The word is actually bisexual, but people have abducted that word and used it for a perversion.
Fair enough. But sexual dimorphism these days, yes.
Or just the word sexual as opposed to asexual. They now believe we're all amoebas.
Apparently.
Okay, even though my sex is in every single cell in my body, including my brain cells. And I know my sex is in my brain cells because men don't think the same as women.
They do not.
Sorry, ladies.
Well, it's not necessarily better or worse, just different in that case.
Well, I noticed that women can often mimic male thinking. But when males try to mimic female thinking, it turns into liberalism. It turns into a type of fussy emotionalism, which is inappropriate for solving men's work. Certain types of problems like how do you deal with the aggression of your neighboring tribe? That's a traditionally masculine problem. The problem of how to get the tribe members to all get along and soothe over arguments and quarrels, that's typically a female problem. And so the female psychology is really apt, is really adroit, is genius at motivating men to get them to do stuff, including get along with each other.
Yep.
Which we're not apt to do.
No.
But when your whole political philosophy becomes female, then your Uncle Sam turns into a nursemaid, turns into a nanny state. See? Now, having a nanny is perfectly good. You need someone to take care of mind the kids, right? The love of a nanny is adorable. You want everyone to take care of the helpless babies, but women can't help but see others as children because that's what they're prone to. That's where their helpful impulses come from. For those women who are still female, the women who lose their femininity have no helpful impulses. They become witches, which is why in fairy tales witches always throwing children in ovens because witches hate children. Well, when a group of men start thinking like women on the political sphere, they turn into witches rather than turn into mothers. Because men make really bad mothers. We make better drill sergeants.
Well, that's fair
frankly.
enough,
Now, everyone's going to be offended by what I just said because ever since I was a young child, our entire society has been devoted to the problem, to the proposition that men and women are utterly equal in every way. The theory being that if we have special geniuses and a differentiation, that is merely a disguised form of oppression. So if a man has short hair and a woman has long hair, that's a disguised form of oppression. If women buy more romance magazines than they buy slaughter novels, that's a disguised form of oppression.
Of course it is.
But
why not?
But the fact of the matter is that without those differences, romantic love has no obstacles to overcome. I myself am of the opposite camp. I believe that men and women are about as different in psychology as it's possible for two intelligent creatures to be and still be members of the same species.
I do believe,
as I said, that women can understand men much better than men can understand women, and can often step into roles in the workplace, for example, and act like men when they're in the minority and they're on their toes. When they get to be in the majority, they turn the workplace into something more like a sewing bee or a home, and it becomes unworkable as a workplace because no one's willing to behave professionally. You see, no one's willing to behave with spit and polish because that's not the way women organize their affairs. Not when they're in groups. That's not how they do things. When two men talk, there's usually a winner and a loser.
Yes.
When two women talk, they usually affirm each other.
They try to come to a consensus.
Yeah, their social hierarchy is based on an indirect rather than a direct way of resolving conflict. You see?
Some would say that goes back to hunter-gatherer days, where you need to, if you're gathering as a group, you need to all get along and be able to work issues out. But if you're out doing the hunting, the best solution is important because inferior solutions get people killed. So.
And when you're out hunting, competitiveness actually urges each runner to continue to run because we humans are persistence hunters. We tend to run the game to exhaustion, which is why dogs are friends of ours because they're also persistence hunters. And when we focus on the game, on the animal running away, we ignore everything else as irrelevant. When the women folk go out to pick fruit, they pay careful attention to color, size, shape, texture, and also things like whether or not the child is blushing with a fever or blushing with excitement. You see, they have to be able to distinguish those differences. The human eye is also particularly well designed to detect snakes moving in the grass, better than almost any other primate. Because apparently back in the day, back when we all lived in the forest, snakes attacking our children was the number one predatorial animal you had to worry about. And so if you ever see a religious icon of a Madonna, of a mother holding her child up and trampling a snake, that is a sacred picture for a reason. Because the snake is the number one source of the threat, and the reason why the occipital lobe of our brain, the visual cortex, is so large, was to aid us in distinguishing the patterns of subtle motions, of being able to tell what was important and what was not. So in any case, when your manfolk is staring at the TV during the big game, his ancient hunter instincts are having him focus completely on what he's pursuing, and he's not gonna. He might say yes, dear, but he didn't really hear what you said. Female ability to pay attention to 2 and 5 things at once is based on the same difference in psychology, the one we were just talking about. Because if you're out collecting the fruit and you have to be on the lookout for snakes to protect the young ones, that's what you got to look out for.
You got to do more than one thing at a time. Got to multitask.
And you have to multitask, right?
Yes.
So the people who say that a man can become a woman, if they were Cartesian spiritualists, I'd believe them. If they said, through magic, my spirit, which was born male in my previous life, has been reincarnated into a female body, and it's the wrong body, therefore I would like to dress in male clothing and be addressed with a male name. And you could, that would be cowardly, but at least it would be reasonable if we both agreed that spirits existed and could exist separate from bodies. But if you don't believe in the supernatural at all, then how can your meat computer, if you believe the brain is a meat computer, and that every cell in the man's brain is XY chromosome, and every single neural cell in the female brain is XX chromosome, so that she must have a female brain, and there's no reality aside from the material reality, because reality is not real. How can you say that the male hardware is running female software? Because the software doesn't exist in your system.
It's all just
because
hardware.
Nothing exists in your system except for matter in motion. You see, and there's also no morality.
It's a good question.
If there's no morality in your system, then why ought I treat you as a female if you feel feminine? Why do I owe you anything? Why ought I be polite to you and use your preferred pronouns? How come you don't use my preferred adjectives?
It's just right. Well, it's the old is-ought gap that comes about as soon as you try to. On the classical sort of scholastic Aristotelian understanding, there is no is-ought gap. Things have a proper end,
right?
And they're supposed to. Well, they ought to embody their final end, and if they're not aimed at their final end, that's wrong. That's just, they're not supposed to be doing that. And that doesn't have to be that has an obvious moral dimension to it, but using a sword as a pry bar is wrong. It's not morally wrong. It's just you'll break the thing doing it because it's not intended. That's not its proper end. That's not its proper purpose. Swords are for stabbing and cutting things.
Right.
It's not necessarily a moral dimension, but again, there is a moral dimension. Humans have a proper end, and if you deviate from that end, that's wrong.
And humans have a proper end above and beyond their animal ends. Mm-hmm. According to Darwinism, the only thing that is rewarded by inanimate nature is our survivability and our fecundity. But animals also survive and are fecund. But humans also have other aspects, other faculties in our soul, where we will be unhappy. We will not fulfill the meaning of our lives if we don't do anything with them. Our reason also has to be satisfied. Our aesthetic judgment also has to be satisfied. We can't live without beauty. If we do that, we'll turn into Democrats. We can't live without reason. If we do that, we'll turn into Marxists. We can't live without faith. If we do that, we'll turn into modernists, postmodernists. And we'll commit suicide. Like the pagans did, who lived without hope.
Yep.
Now, so the proper end of man, the reason why these people don't believe reality is real is because they don't want to believe there's a proper end of man. They don't want to believe that life has meaning, you see. But if reality is real, then words have meaning and thoughts have meaning and life has meaning, because the meaning can't come from nowhere if reality is real. Reality is where meaning comes from, you see. And you can tell real meaning from unreal meaning, because if reality is real, that's the yardstick you use to tell true from false.
Of course.
But if reality is merely what you make of it, if you are the king of Pointland from Edward Abbott's Flatland, pardon me, let me explain to the viewers. Mr. A Squared of Flatland was taken on an adventure and met other dimensions, and including the creatures of Lineland, who only exist in one dimension, backward and forward, and the king of Pointland, who only existed in a dimensionless location of existence. And the king of Pointland was extremely self-satisfied with himself because he filled all of reality and was his own necessary being, his own unmoved mover, and his own first cause for all things. So that even so much so that when Mr. A Squared questioned the king of Pointland and told him that other beings existed, the king of Pointland rejoiced in his own omniscience, because now he invented an imaginary dialogue with himself, because he attributed the voice he heard to himself as the cause of all things, merely by questioning his own unique singularity to make it all the more glorious. So much for the king of Pointland. Edward Abbott wrote that as a mockery, as a joke. And in the same way that the book 1984 by George Orwell is taken as a reality that was meant as gallows humor, so too the egocentricity, the solipsism, the grotesque narcissism of the king of Pointland is taken as the only reality by the moderns who wish to be God. Wow. They wish to be in charge of their own lives in a way that humans cannot be.
I suppose.
And that's why they don't believe in reality. Because once you believe in reality, you realize that you don't fill it.
Well, yes.
There's more to it than you. It doesn't. Once you believe in reality, you realize it doesn't revolve around you. If call Copernicus.
If reality is real, you don't get to be God on the throne because someone's already there, as they say.
Yeah.
And that gets in the way. I mean, I'm reminded, I always sort of come back to...
let me interrupt and say,
sure.
If reality is real, you can't have your cake and eat it too.
That's true.
You have to grow up if reality is real. You have to prioritize, make decisions, make hard choices, live with the results of your choices. You see?
We kind of have that.
Get along with other people. Man up if you're a man, and feminize if you're a woman. And envy doesn't like it when you behave according to the way you're supposed to behave. Envy would prefer that you try to behave according to some other person's good, and get the benefits of his work without doing his work. So envy is opposed to reality. Pride is opposed to reality. All the deadly sins are opposed to reality.
I was going to say sin is opposed to reality, yes. For although they knew God, they did not honor him or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal men and birds, and animals and creeping things. And he goes on to say, therefore they gave up, God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies. It's interesting that people read that, and I think a lot of people miss the point. A lot of people think
he's talking about sexual perversion there.
Well,
he's talking about the thing. He's talking about the thing that we celebrate during Pride Month. As when God abandons them to their.
I agree.
To their lusts.
But what's interesting about it is, no, that's it. God abandons them to it. It's just you want to give up on God, and God doesn't sort of. In the sense, God doesn't punish you for that. God says, God's punishment is to say, okay, do what you like. But you're going to go insane. You're going to give up everything. You're going to lose your minds. if you pursue this course, trying to make sense of the world,
Yeah.
trying to live this life where you've given up on the creator because you don't want the rules. Well, that's fine, but you will go mad and you will lose everything.
And you literally will go mad. You'll go mad philosophically, even if you don't go mad neurologically, because your model no longer maps to reality, because you say there is no reality. You use in the case of sexual perversion, you use the most powerful drive in the human instinct
Mm-hmm.
you channel it into infertile, futile, unrewarding, and unfruitful channels. You can't make a family out of it. People nowadays are trying to dress up their catamite, sodomite relationships with family names, but all you can do is put false names to things, and it's like putting face paint on a corpse. You can't actually bring it to life again.
Mm.
You can't make something that's dead alive merely by using a word and saying, I'm going to define that as alive. Okay? You can't define reality into existence. Nor can you make reality going away by refusing to define it. And those are both things that people do when they try to use when they adopt political correctness as a methodology. They give up on the meaning of life, and God simply lets them do it. He's not going to impose on you.
Which in many ways strikes me as more horrifying. I mean, it's not
love,
because you can't even say God is oppressing me and not letting me be who I want to be, because he's not doing anything. In that sense, he's just saying, if that's what you want, I will give you what you want. Trust me, you don't want this, but you're not going to listen.
Right.
So I will let you have what you want. Hopefully, so you will see the error of your ways and come back to me. But then you don't.
We wish that God would impose upon us and make us be good when we don't want to be. But love, by its definition, not even an omnipotent, omniscient being can make love involuntary. There's no such thing as a voluntary involuntary. There's no such thing as a willful unwilled, okay? So if I'm leaving the atmosphere of love and plunging my face into the pond, the sewer of hate, and I say, well, I would like to breathe sewage now rather than air, the air can say to me, well, wait, that's not going to sustain you.
Mm.
And I can't follow you down into the sewage because I'm air. You have to breathe air to get the benefit of breathing air.
Mm.
Okay? You have to step into the light in order to be in the light. If you step away from the light, you'll be in the darkness by definition. Now, I, as a Christian, don't believe the darkness is a real thing. I don't believe it has substance. I don't believe in that sense it has reality. I think it's merely the absence of light.
Mm.
The same way I believe evil is just a perversion of good. The evil is when you take some good and you twist it to a wrong end.
Mm.
Even things like pride, which are sins, it can have a correct end. If you have pride of workmanship, if you give glory to God, if you use the talents that God has given you for his greater glory, then you're not thinking about yourself. You're not putting yourself on the throne of God.
That's the problem with the word pride in English. There's two meanings.
Right.
There's two meanings, and one is fine, and one is
Right.
wrong. And
Right. Even the word "is" has two meanings in English. One is identity, and the other is membership. You see.
Yep.
So if I say I am of God, that sounds like I'm saying I'm God. It's not. I'm saying I'm his image. The same way a coin bears the stamp of the king's face to show you the coin is good. But if you don't believe that man is the image of God, then because you don't believe in reality, then man becomes just an animal like any other animal. He merely walks on hind legs.
Yep.
You see. But unlike other animals, we're not allowed to eat meat when we become animal rights activists.
That is weird, isn't it? We are just other animals. Other animals eat each other all the time. Therefore, we have a moral obligation. That would imply we're not animals, because animals don't have moral obligations to each other.
Correct. But if you don't believe in reality, and reality includes the fact that we're made in the image of God, that's part of reality. Part of the reality is that humans have dignity, innate dignity. It's something that's there. It doesn't depend on your opinion. It doesn't go away when you close your eyes. That's what reality means. Let's use that as a good definition of reality. Reality is what does not go away when you close your eyes. Okay? You cannot believe in the color red if you don't want, because red does seem to disappear when you close your eyes. But it's still there. When your eyes are open, it's still going to be there. Someone else looking over your shoulder is going to see it. A camera's going to pick it up. You know? Likewise, the dignity of man is there whether your eyes are open or not. Even if your whole society denies that man has dignity. Even if your whole society says, well, only the poor have dignity, capitalists do not. They're vermin. They must be destroyed.
Wow.
Or if your whole society says, this race is the oppressing race, it's got to be destroyed. Or if your society says this race is the slave race, it has to be enthralled, has to be enslaved. Doesn't matter. Societies can be wrong. They've been wrong in the past. But if there's no reality, there's no way for society to be wrong. If there's no reality, there's no way, there's no groundwork to disagree with a tyrant. There's no such thing as revolution if there's no reality.
That is the irony, isn't it? They want to be revolutionaries. They want to pull the rug out from reality, but they definitely have strong opinions about how things are wrong and how things should be different.
Right. And they talk in moralistic terms, even though they don't believe in morality.
Well,
but if there's no reality, how can right be right and wrong be wrong?
Of course.
You know.
But I mean, I suspect it wouldn't be half as useful to them if they were actually consistent. So, I mean, let's be honest. They're not consistent because being consistent would be totally unlivable.
Correct.
So they can't be consistent.
And being consistent would drive them back toward God, which is where they don't want to be. That's the only real rebellion that's going on. It's the rebellion of Satan.
Yep.
Now, if you were in rebellion against Zeus or Odin or some other pagan god, it could be understandable how you would want to leave that god and apply to join up with the god of Confucius or the god of Buddha or something. But if you're in rebellion against the Christian God, you're in rebellion against the unmoved mover. So that you're in rebellion against cause and effect. You're in rebellion against the absolute good. So you're in rebellion against all abstract thinking, all forms. You're in rebellion against causation and form. You're in rebellion against the Logos, because Christ is also the Logos. That means you don't believe A is A. So you get to the location where, like my friend, I is not I, reality is not real, I don't exist, the color red is an illusion, all things are illusions, all words are false, and the only real words are politically correct words. And then nothing means anything and everything means nothing. But what it really means is whatever the party says goes, whatever the tyrant says goes.
In practice.
See, they're trying to pull down God, claiming God's a tyrant, and then all they do is they set up a human tyrant in his place. And he's not as good as God. Because he will force you to do things.
And the human tyrant will be, unlike God, the human tyrant will be corrupted by the power. Well, I suppose that's the question.
Yes.
Does power corrupt, or does power attract the corruptible?
Does it matter? Even Solomon in all his wisdom could not use an illegitimate power in a legitimate fashion.
That's true.
So,
well, it possibly.
I used to be on the newspaper, and I used to cover the planning and zoning board as they would meet to decide whether or not people could build a swimming pool in their backyard, or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the laws were poorly written, were not clear. They weren't written like that. Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. Okay. So all that ended up happening is the planning and zoning board would end up making an arbitrary decision, and trying to make their arbitrary decision look as it was based on something, and it never was. So even with the best will in the world, and I don't think these people had the best will in the world, believe you me, they were corrupt as all get out. But even if they had been uncorrupt at the beginning, you can't be not corrupt if none of your decisions can be just. You see?
Yeah, no, that does make sense.
So,
which brings us to the question of where does this madness come from? And I will say, I think it comes back to the turn to nominalism back in the Middle Ages when they abandoned scholasticism, as everything that's wrong with the world today does. That's probably not strictly true, but that is the cancer at the heart of a lot of it.
Tell the viewers what nominalism is and what gave rise to it, because I myself am not that familiar with the period.
Fair enough. So nominalism is the idea that actually, I think that's the wrong way to explain it, because I found it confusing until it was explained the other way. The alternative to it is sort of Aristotelian realism, which is to say, objects have forms, and the mind perceives the forms that are actually out in the world. What have I got? This water bottle is approximately spherical. For the sake of argument, let's pretend it is actually spherical.
I would prefer to call it cylindrical than spherical, just for the sake of ease of
That's
ease of,
true, because
discussion.
I'm using the wrong word. But cylindrical, thank you. Oh no, I am cursed with the... I've been cursed with, no, it's spherical. I believe it, that's what makes it so. Not really. This is cylindrical, and this bottle is cylindrical, and they have something in common, which is being they have cylindricalness in common between the two.
Right.
They're obviously different objects, but they embody something real, which is cylindricalness, the form of cylindricalness.
Right.
Which is a
embody
terrible example, because cylindricalness is an awful word. But I need balls. Balls work.
But they also both have the final cause of being meant to hold liquid
This is true.
for human convenience.
Yes.
So there's a number of things we can say about them. Now, I notice that they're not perfect mathematical cylinders, but I know what some of the properties of perfect mathematical cylinders are, and all cylinders have those properties in common.
They do.
No matter how many cylinders you draw, I can say certain things that are going to be true for all of them. For example, I could tell you what the ratio is between the height, the radius of the base, and the volume,
Yep.
for example. That ratio is always going to be the same, no matter what the size of the cylinder.
This is
But
true.
those bottles aren't going to match that because they're made of atoms, and the atoms are irregular.
And imperfect,
You
yes.
see? They're not perfect.
Thank you.
They grow in the heat and shrink in the cool, for example.
So that's...
So
Yes.
my model of cylindricalness doesn't map perfectly onto the cylindrical object in my hand.
No.
So what do you make of that? Where does that lead?
Oh, well, that reality imperfectly instantiates that cylinders exist. Doesn't mean that there's no cylinder. They don't have something in common that's real.
So the scholastics, following Plato, thought that both were real.
Yes.
The real idea of a cylinder is really reflected, though imperfectly, in the real physical cylinder that exists in the world of the senses.
And
So the world of the mind is perceived by the mind, and the world of the senses is perceived by the senses.
well, this is
We good so far as to what the scholastics thought?
pretty much. It should be noted that in practice, this means when you look at a cylindrical object, when you apprehend the form of a cylinder in the world, you apprehend that in your mind, and there's a real connection between the two because they both reflect something they have in common. So that
And more to the point, any conclusions you come to about the nature of cylinders in the abstract, perceived with the mind, will also be true of the cylinder in reality to the degree that it correctly reflects
yes,
the properties of a cylinder.
that's right.
Which it will not do perfectly,
No.
because it will come into being and go out of being. You
Yeah.
know.
But and
Now,
the
here's
form,
what I think is interesting about that. If I can interrupt
sure,
for
go
just a
on.
second, there's no such thing as pi in the real world, in the world of the senses.
That's true.
Anything that looks like a circle is going to be made of atoms. Atoms are basically little round balls. They're not exactly balls. they're clouds, but let's treat them as balls for now. However many little balls there are between the radius of a circle in my hand and the circumference of a circle in my hand. Let's say I'm using a string of pearls, a pearl necklace. I drape it into a vaguely circular form. And then I'd have another strand of pearls going from roughly the middle to roughly the edge. The number of beads is going to be a whole number, and the number of beads of the circumference is going to be a whole number. So the ratio between those beads is going to be a whole number ratio, a rational ratio. But pi, the real ratio between radius and circumference of a
Is
circle,
irrational, yes.
is never a whole number ratio. Is always an irrational ratio.
Yep.
That means you have never seen a circle in your whole life. It is not a sensible object. There is no such thing as pi in the real world. So if you don't believe in the world of the mind, you realists, or you non-realists, or whatever you want to call yourself, you people who don't believe in the spirit world, who don't believe in the mental world, who don't believe in the world of the forms, where do you get the notion of pi? Because I can tell you where I get it. I get it from reality.
Well,
But it's not it's a non-physical reality. Okay?
yes.
It's a mental reality.
But with that,
It exists in all time and space. It does not age. Pi doesn't change through time. It doesn't change if it's big or small. It does not exist in extension. It doesn't exist in 3 dimensions.
no.
You only need 2 dimensions to get pi. Okay, so where are circles? The answer is you've never seen one, but we all know what they
We
are.
don't know what they are. But this brings
We've all seen reflections of them. We've all seen shadows of them.
Yes. So establishing
Okay.
this idea that forms exist, that's Aristotelian realism, the theory of causation. There's a bunch to it. But
Right.
nominalism seeks to say that forms aren't real, effectively. That's part of it.
That they're not objective, that they're man-made.
Well, just that they basically...
That we concocted the words we use to describe
Yeah,
things.
exactly. So these things don't really have any actual existence outside of our minds, sort of.
Right. So in other words, it's not a discovery, it's an invention, like a poet's
That's a good way to
invention.
put it. Yes.
When I say that pi is an irrational number, according to them, that's not a discovery, that's something I made up, an invention that Pythagoras made up. Well, then how come it's true no matter who does it? How come it's true for all observers?
Well, there you go. But there's problems with nominalism. You get the obvious infinite regress. They're left with the explanation of clearly 2 red things have something in common between them, but they want to deny that and say they're just 2 instances of unrelated objects. What do they have in common? What does a fire truck and a stop sign have in common? Well, that's just our apprehension of redness, sort of. You end up with it, and then you end up stuck there going, well, aren't the apprehensions of what we see the forms in that sense? No, you need to go to another, and just... It's not...
Are they claiming that the redness in that case is merely a human convention of speech, that it doesn't exist in reality? Or what are they claiming?
Well, in part, yes. But also, yeah, there's no such thing as redness. There's no such thing as universals. Universals, that's the word I want. That are shared between 2 objects. Like, that's just coincidentally the case. There's not a real relationship there. Fire trucks and stop signs have nothing in common. But
Then how come the fire truck is allowed to go through the red light and my car is not, if there's no red?
convention? I don't know. I'm not a nominalist.
But there are people who have a biological incapacity in their eye called color blindness, where they cannot perceive the red color. But you could give them a camera or an instrument that could perceive it, that could measure it, at least. So there's something there that's measurable, and any 2 observers measuring the same thing will get the same measurement. Now, if that is not objective, then I don't know what the word means.
Well,
See?
I know. I didn't say
Well,
it made
and
sense.
also, what does the word nominalism mean? I mean, do they ever apply their own standards to their own philosophy? If words are merely human conventions, then the word nominalism is merely a human convention. So it doesn't refer to anything in reality. So therefore, nominalism is not real in reality, is it?
No, but nominalism...
It's just real. It's just real as a convention, like the rules of grammar.
But nominalism is useful in some ways because it gets rid of... You get rid of the forms and you get rid of formal causes and final causes from Aristotle, and you have only material and efficient causes and sort of anemic versions of those, and you try to do everything that way, and that's useful because if you have Aristotle's forms, final causes, material and efficient causes, as our good friend Thomas Aquinas showed, you get God. Well, you prove enough of God that you've got a prime mover and you're stuck with him. You can't get away from that.
Right. It's in order to get rid of universals, because if there's no universal, then there's no universal, which we all know as I am who I am.
Yes.
The being that makes all being things, all real things, really real, is the being of being, is the I am who I am. The fundamental being, the necessary being, on whom all beingness depends. Which all men know to be God.
If you're committed
but
to
these
getting
men
away
don't
from
want to
God,
know to be God because they want to sleep around with little boys, so they have to get rid of words
that they do.
in order to do that.
That they do. But that's it, isn't it? I mean, they're trying to get away from something, and...
Well, let's be fair. I believe it's legitimate for, in a technical discussion between lawyers, engineers, or other people, cooks, other people who have a particular necessity of precision, to coin certain terms to mean certain things and to use those words in certain ways that is not the common usage. You know, I mean, I can tell you certain legal phrases in Latin that have particular meaning that don't have a meaning outside that context. And I believe those words are just conventions, that they are just made up by certain people for a certain purpose. But I don't believe you can say that all words are jargon, all words are lingo, because then where does poetry come from?
But even then, if there's a technical term that is used in a specific way in law, for example, it still has a technical defined meaning, and that's still going to depend. That meaning is still going to depend on the shared meaning of other words outside of that sort of technical definition, if that makes sense.
Yes, but I'm saying that you could argue that those are conventions, that those are merely invented for the sake of clarity.
Well, no, they're precise for the sake of clarity, but you're still going to have to define them, and they're still going to be defined with real words, if that makes sense. Like I'm not sure you're actually getting away from.
You're right. I'm wrong. I stand corrected, because when you try to use a word to get something more precise, both you and hopefully the person you're talking to will come to understand that there's a reality there that your current vocabulary isn't sufficient to define. The reason why all real truths are spoken in parable and poetry is because reality does not admit of being precisely defined in a granular fashion. And when you try to be more precise, there's got to be a reality there that you're groping toward, otherwise you wouldn't grope toward it. So in fact, not only am I wrong, it's the very opposite of what I said. The fact that precision exists among professionals proves that reality is real, and it's more real than we normally need it to be for our common speech. In common language, we don't need to distinguish between murder and manslaughter, though in a court of law you do. In common speech, we don't need to make a distinction between a misdemeanor and a felony. In a court of law you do. In common speech, you don't need to make a difference between a socket and a sprocket, but a plumber has to. Otherwise, the toilet's going to run backwards.
Yes.
You know? A cook has to know the difference between a tablespoon and a teaspoon. Otherwise, the things will taste terrible. Okay. But you and I, layman, can say spoonful.
Yep.
I just want a spoonful of sugar. It doesn't matter if it's a tablespoon or a teaspoonful. You know, though, if you're on a diet.
Unless you're a diabetic,
spoon,
it could make all the difference.
Well, I don't think Mary Poppins is going to feed a diabetic a big spoonful of sugar anyway, so.
Who knows?
She knows what she's doing. So Mary Poppins proves that nominalists are insane.
Well,
what happened to nominalism after the Middle Ages, though? Why did it... Just saying that words are human inventions, that there's no universals, how do you get to reality not being real from that? Well, that's where we are now. That's what postmoderns believe.
The problem is the idea infects everything. I would contend the problem is once you try to get away from formal and final causes, once you say there aren't any forms, once you say these things have nothing in common, if you try to take this idea seriously, everything's going to break down. You run into the problems where Hume had with causation, saying two things aren't necessarily connected, cause and effect.
Hume, the empiricist, said there's no such thing as cause and effect because the study of empirical cause and effect led him to believe there could be no such thing as empiricism, because without cause and effect you can't study empiricism, because you can't study what causes effects.
Well,
without cause and effect you can't study effect.
Sorry,
Hume.
But you run into these sorts of problems. You run into
There's no law of gravity if there's no universals, because you just have falling apples, falling cue balls, falling birds, but you don't have fallingness, falling objects.
Effectively, yes. But I mean, it's just the idea sort of infects everything, and well, as Paul said, what is it? They did not honor God or give thanks to them, but became futile in their thinking, and their hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools.
So futile in your thinking means once you no longer believe the red light and the red fire truck are red, you stop thinking that the white man and the black man are both men. If they're different races, they're different species.
This is the problem.
You stop thinking that the man and the woman are both humans. because they're different sexes, they're different species.
But they don't have... Yeah,
You stop thinking the man and the dog are different creatures. They're both animals, therefore they're the same.
but two men don't have anything in common either. Like, it all
Right.
it all dissolves.
But it
all
works both ways. You not only can't divide things, you also can't group things.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't discriminate between any two objects that are similar, but neither can you aggregate objects that are dissimilar.
And eventually, where do you end up? You just end up with...
Well, all words are defined by the similarities and the aggregations of genus and species. A word, what makes a word is that
Everything
it
dissolves.
collects together things that have a common property and ignores the properties that are indifferent to that definition. If I say redness, I don't care if it's a red ball or a red cube.
Yeah.
If I say put all red objects in the box when I'm telling my children to clean the room, okay, the redness is the crucial quality. Well, if there's no crucial qualities anymore, there's no way to clean the room. There's no way to do anything because no word refers to a group of objects.
Everything dissolves. It all dissolves into...
Right. But you can't have one word only refer to one object either, because there's no such thing as one object.
No, there's...
By which I mean, imagine one molecule that exists for 1 second in one place at one time, with a group of molecular properties. But no, if you had a language that had as many words as there are molecules in the universe, and the new words came into existence every time the atoms moved per second, you would live in the like a Borgian universe of meaninglessness. No, the language would not be a language, because you couldn't take two words and say these two things have a property in common that makes them a member of a set. Does that make sense?
Yep.
You can't. A word is always a set of things. It's never a single thing.
Well, this is...
Even if it's one object,
Yeah.
it's an object over time.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it refers to a timeless object, it's also everything that participates in that object's form. So you can't get away with it. You can't get away from thinking. You can't get away from using symbols to refer to reality.
Agreed.
You see? So that's why the moderns try to say that reality is not real, because they want to lie. A lie is when your symbols don't match your reality. Your model doesn't match what the model is trying to predict.
The problem they run into is this is a tar baby that will stick to them and infect and ruin everything. You can't just
Right.
do it a little bit is the problem. They want to do it a little bit, but reality,
like
the gears of
like
reality don't mesh like that. So,
It's like being a little bit pregnant. Because reality is coherent. If you're incoherent in one aspect, you're going to be incoherent in all the aspects.
that's true.
Now, one thing we didn't discuss is the theory that you can have a coherent model of reality that doesn't reflect reality at all. I would say, for example, non-Euclidean geometry doesn't have any real-world application on the surface of the Earth. It's a coherent theory, but it doesn't. Parallel lines on the surface of the Earth actually do not converge infinitely with never meeting. That doesn't happen. You have to draw it on a curve or some other way. I have heard that among astrophysicists, that over large enough areas where the Einsteinian warp of space-time causes the space to behave in a more Lobachevskian or Riemannian fashion, that you have some application for non-Euclidean geometry there. But the argument between, let's say, the geocentric theory and the heliocentric theory is an argument between which model maps onto reality. But do nominalists believe in reality, or they just believe in the model?
I'm not sure. I mean, at the end of the day, I think if you take it seriously, everything is going to dissolve into nothing. There will be no reality. It'll cause problems everywhere. It'll destroy your philosophy. I mean, you want to get away from you want to have sex as you want to have sex, so you abandon you come up with justifications why moral rules don't apply, and you pretend they're just word games, but infects everything, and before you know it, you're claiming you don't exist, mind doesn't exist, objects don't exist. Just everything falls apart.
But why do you still claim science exists and that you follow the science?
Who knows? Actually, that's interesting.
I have a theory. I think that sex is the core of it, because basically the strongest temptation. I believe that romance is the strongest instinct in the human frame.
Fair enough.
I could be wrong about that. It could be self-will, the desire to look good to your neighbors. Maybe I'm wrong about what's the strongest impulse.
It's certainly
Maybe
one
I'm
of
just
the
revealing a
strong
little bit
ones.
about my psychology that I shouldn't.
It's one of the strongest.
So if you want to
ones.
commit a sexual immorality, then the man wants to act not like a man. Okay? Now, I mean something very particular by that. A man is supposed to act like a gentleman. That's what the perfect man is supposed to be. That means a chaste man. Chastity is a masculine virtue among men. Chastity is a feminine virtue among women. When the women want to be unchaste, they're actually acting unwomanly. You see? So the idea to destroy the difference between the sexes is a fundamental idea if you want to normalize unchastity. Sexual perversion is merely a side effect once adultery and fornication is normalized. But that means trying to get each person to act not according to his nature. And I mean his highest nature, his good, the thing toward which he is directed, for which he is made. Like opening a paint can with a screwdriver. Now, when feminists try to get women to act like men, they never try to get them to act like gentlemen. They try to get them to act like cads.
They do.
Men who talk about their love affairs, men who have more than one partner, men who are not good fathers and husbands.
Isn't it
Because
interesting?
Because the nature of man is to have one wife for life.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that's his nature because that's what we naturally vow. No man goes down on one knee to a woman and says, "Oh, I'll love you for weeks." Does he?
No, this is
it's
true.
It's not instinctive. It's not natural for him to do that.
I was going to say, isn't it interesting that feminism seeks to destroy everything about women, to get women to reject their nature, and the new idea on the block that's in competition with that is the trans movement, which does the same thing. It has a common element, which is trying to get people to deny their nature and become something they're not, even though feminism seeks to have women in trousers and short hair and make themselves as unfeminine as possible. But the trans movement seeks to make men into women, and make them to the point of being caricatures of feminized women.
Right. Like a blackface is a caricature of a Negro.
But
trans is a caricature of a female.
But certainly. But what I found interesting is they have such people look at it and go, they're going in opposite directions, but actually from a slightly different perspective, they're pursuing the same thing, which is rejecting nature. Fundamentally
Correct.
rejecting
nature.
Nature.
Because the short hair and the trousers, those are cultural expressions of an eternal truth. The eternal truth is that femininity is feminine. What they're trying to get rid of is chastity, which is to say honesty. The word chastity means you're honest with your sex partner. That's all it means. Okay? The reason why honesty requires you take a lifelong vow of fidelity is because that's what nature prompts. That's what lovers naturally want to do. They want to be in love forever. They don't want to be in love for weeks. Okay? So it is to get rid of honesty, the honesty of your own nature, your highest nature, mind you, not your animal nature, because we have both an animal nature and an angelic nature. So they're trying to divide those two natures and get rid of them, and getting rid of the outward cultural expressions of femininity is a side effect. What they're trying to get rid of is your soul. They're trying to make it so that your emotion, your passion, your sexual passion, will frustrate and hinder you and cause you pain so that you'll commit suicide. That's what that goal is. The goal is they want you to be self-destructive. That's what sin is. Sin is you destroying yourself. Virtue is you making yourself wholesome again, whole again, healthy again. It's making yourself real again. They're trying to make you unreal. They're trying to make you into a caricature of what you're supposed to be. But what life means you to be is yourself, your real self. So you should believe in yourself, ironically enough.
So this brings us to the final question. How do we fix it? Well, obviously, repent and turn back to God, as we always say.
Repentance, prayer, ashes, and humility.
I'm not sure there's any...
Humility is the one quality our society has completely forgotten.
This is true. I suppose there's no, there's not really anything else to do there too. I mean, just we need to accept that reality is real and live in accordance with it. But
Correct.
there is a creator on the throne, and he has demands on your life and wants not onerous. I mean, the reality is not onerous.
His
demands
yoke is
either.
lighter, so I've heard.
Yes, he wants your best. He wants all of his demands. All of his demands on your life are effectively because he loves you, because he wants the best for you, because he wants you to be perfected. At the end of the day, he wants you to be happy.
He wants you to be more real. He wants you to
Yeah.
basically all. If you read the 10 Commandments carefully, the commandments are stop hitting yourself,
This is true.
stop hurting yourself, stop wounding yourself, snap out of it.
This
See,
is true.
that's what we need. We need to snap out of it. We need people to tell each other, "Do you feel like you're a victim and society's oppressing you? Well, snap out of it." Okay, that's what we really need. Yeah, we need a slap in the face. We need to read pagans, because the pagans knew that man was meant to live according to nature. Read the Stoics, read Epictetus, read Marcus Aurelius. They knew it. Read Aristotle, read Plato. These guys knew it, and the Christians knew it even better,
And then
even more clearly.
When you get to the
Read
end of
Confucius.
them,
Confucius has nothing but a list of demands as to what you must do to organize society according to a logical, rational, harmonious reality. All these guys knew this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All humanity has known it from the first time man took pen to paper. That's the other thing we need to do, is not just repent of our folly, but also return to our ancestors and read what they wrote.
I was going to say, once you've finished reading the pagans and you find there's no hope there, only duty, then graduate to Paul and Jesus and
Yes.
find hope.
Read the prognosis of the disease first before you read up on
The
the
cure.
cure is.
Yes.
You see, but modern men don't even realize there's a disease. If reality is not real, then they're not sinners. The pagans knew something was wrong with their lives. We believe that if anything's wrong with our life, it's because the patriarchy is oppressing me. I'm the victim,
We have
and no one will say to me, "Snap out of it."
in abandoning Christ, we are not merely returned to the pagans, but we are going even lower than them. They at least knew they needed help. We're
And
below
they
even
knew
that.
reality was real.
We are below
They thought
even
life
that.
was
Yeah.
They thought life was cruel. We Christians know the huge secret, which was that when God made the world, he pronounced it very good. That's not obvious to the eye. Nature does not look very good to the person starving in the snowstorm,
True.
okay, dying in the wilderness. We can see that it is because we can see deeper because we're awake. So that's the answer also. We have to wake up. We have to wake up from the madness.
Well, on that note, I think that's the right place to end. We need to wake up from the madness. Thank you for joining me this week, John.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.